Hello again, I'm Mark Samples, and in this video I'm going to show you how to distinguish between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources in your research. I'm also going to tell you why this is important and why it will help you with your research process. In previous videos, I discussed exactly what to do in your first 2 hours of research on a new project, and then I did another video on how to get 30 sources in 15 minutes. If you haven't seen those videos, you might want to check them out as well. Links are below in the description. But now that you are deep into sources in your research project, what you want to do is distinguish between types of sources. So first, let's describe the types of sources and what they mean. Then I will tell you a little bit about how to manage them for your research project. I will be using a music history project as an example in this video, but these principles will apply to any type of research project that you are working on. All right, let's dive in. Okay, just before we get to the definitions of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, let's get to our conclusion first so that we know where we're going. In your research project, you want to cite primary and secondary sources in your project. Avoid citing tertiary sources, and that's because you want to make it a habit to go to the source. If you want to see a written version of this video that's very similar to this video, you can go to my website and find an essay on it there, link below in the description as well. So what are primary, secondary, and tertiary sources? I'm going to give you a description from this wonderful book on research called The Craft of Research, the 4th edition, by William T. Fitzgerald and other authors. And in this, they describe primary sources as the original or raw materials, the evidence you'll use to develop, test, and ultimately justify your hypothesis or claim. What this means is, in history, if you're doing a topic on history or music history, primary source documents are the letters that composers have written. They are artifacts from the time under study. They're maps from the time under study. Scores, musical scores, are considered primary source documents. These are raw material documents that need interpretation from you, the scholar, in order to make sense of them. Okay, that's primary source documents. What are secondary source documents? Well, secondary is one level removed from primary, meaning secondary sources are books, articles, or reports that are based on primary sources and are intended for scholarly or professional audiences. That means it's something that a scholar has looked at primary source documents and secondary source documents and then written an analysis on your topic. So all of these scholarly books that you're finding in your research process, the scholarly articles that you're finding, are secondary sources. Now, what are tertiary sources? Tertiary sources are books and articles that synthesize and report on secondary sources for general readers. So if you think about it, we're getting progressively farther away from the raw data. And so tertiary sources summarize or synthesize secondary sources, such as books and articles. Tertiary sources do not typically interact with primary sources. So what does this mean? The articles in Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians or in encyclopedias, these are tertiary sources. And the principle is that in your paper, you want to cite primary and secondary sources and avoid citing tertiary sources. Why is this? Because you want to base your knowledge not on a summary of an analysis, but on the analysis itself, the secondary sources. And when possible, you want to go straight to the primary sources to see for yourself what the material is saying. Okay, to get a better handle on what types of sources these would be in a music history project, let's use an example of a project that is researching Duke Ellington's compositions of the 1940s. What would be some examples of primary sources? Well, the primary sources would include his manuscript scores, Ellington's letters, newspaper articles from the 1940s, magazine articles from the 1940s, and any other documents that were written at the time. For instance, perhaps critical reviews of his compositions. So those would all be primary source documents because they're raw materials that you as the scholar need to interpret. What about secondary source materials? These would include scholarly books and articles on Ellington that were written more recently. For instance, the biography Beyond Category by John Edward Hassey would be a secondary source because Hassey went to the Smithsonian, looked at all of Ellington's papers and his compositions, all the primary source documents, and then wrote his book based on those primary source documents. So now we have a secondary source. And also any scholarly articles on Ellington or books that we find would be secondary sources. A tertiary source would be the article on Ellington from Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians in Oxford Music Online. Now, these three are examples of primary, secondary, and tertiary source documents on a topic in Ellington. Now, notice again that we're getting progressively farther away from the source. Okay, so that's really the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So now that we know the definitions of these types of sources, and we've gotten some examples of what they would look like on a project on Ellington, let's get a sense for how you should be using your primary, secondary, and tertiary sources in your research project for a music history or any other type of project. The standard for scholars is to use primary and secondary sources in their research. Primary and secondary sources. Scholars avoid using tertiary sources because the principle is you want to go to the source. You don't want to rely on someone else's summary of an analysis or of the raw data. So while you might go to Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians to get a sense for your topic, it's now your responsibility to go and survey and review the secondary literature on your topic. This is what you're doing during that bibliography sprint exercise in which you collect 30 sources or more on your topic. The next step is then to review these sources to see the state of what other people have known and said and argued on your topic. But how do primary sources fit into all of this for a music history project in a survey course? Well, while you will likely not have time or opportunity to do extensive research in archival documents or other sorts of primary source documents, you can engage with primary sources through study of scores, for instance, if that's appropriate, but then also perhaps newspaper or magazine articles at the time under study. For instance, with Ellington, I might go and find some of the reviews of his music at that time in the 1940s and use that as evidence. So while in a survey paper like the one in music history, you probably won't engage extensively with primary source documents. As you do larger research projects for, say, a senior project or a master's thesis or something beyond that in your professional life, you will more extensively be expected to engage with the primary source documents. To summarize, let's get a sense of the flow of how you will use these types of sources in your music history research project. You'll likely start with tertiary sources in order to get an overview of your topic. These are dictionaries and encyclopedias. Use the bibliographies of those tertiary sources to find secondary sources, scholarly books and articles on your topic. Then as you review those secondary sources, find primary sources such as music scores, letters, or newspaper articles from the time under study on your topic. So while you may start with tertiary sources in the process of research, by the time you get to the writing and citing of your actual paper, you want to avoid using those tertiary sources in favor of secondary and primary sources. So that's the overview of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Remember, the farther away you get from the source itself is how you get from primary, secondary, and tertiary. And what you want to do is you want to focus your scholarship in when you're actually writing your paper on secondary and primary sources, and the tertiary sources will help you get a handle on your topic. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing to my channel. I plan to make more videos like this on the research process and other associated topics. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.